It is a wonderful honor to welcome Steve Saylor to this podcast. He is a writer and a blogger of much infamy and I suppose disrepute. He recently came out with a very, very interesting collection of his greatest hits essay called Noticing, an Essential Reader, 1973 to 2023. Welcome to the show, Steve. How are you?
I'm good. Good. Thank you for having me on your show.
Okay, so as you requested, my first question is related to The Bell Curve,
All
authored
right.
by Richard Bernstein and Charles Murray. It has been 30 years since his publication. I actually wrote a blog post piece about it on my own Substack, and because of that, I lost one friend. Yeah, I make the case that the book is still like a significant piece of social science literature, and that it still needs to be read today. And and she was saying that Charles Murray is racist, bigot, and whatnot. And yeah, our friendship
Yeah.
ended from there. So yeah,
Yeah.
Belker.
Yes, you reminded me. I haven't written a 30th anniversary um, piece on the Bell Curve. I wrote one in 2004. I wrote one in 2014. So I really owe it to Charles, who wrote a very nice review in the Claremont Review of Books of my anthology, Noticing, earlier this year. Um, what's What's to say about the Bell Curve after 30 years? It's probably, it says a lot about about how American social science, or as it's popularly conceived by people who aren't actually familiar with the social science, uh, how things have just basically gotten stuck. Uh, the idea that in the United States there could be permanent, or if not permanent, long enduring gaps between the various racial groups, however defined, but let's just use the federal government's definitions because certainly seem to be good enough for government work. We've been using them for decades now. Everybody claims that science has proven that race does not exist, and yet whenever the Democrats get in power, uh, do they throw out the old racial classifications used since Nixon's time? Nah, they just create new ones like, oh, okay, now we're gonna have a Middle Eastern and North African race, so we can give out more affirmative action. All right, what's happened is basically um, the country's gotten stuck. It just decided, the establishment decided that the bell curve was going to be the ditch it would die on in terms of what future science would demonstrate. That it was absolutely intolerable and inconceivable that Herrnstein and Murray's moderate compromise position, that it looks like both nature and nurture influence average IQ scores just as they influence all sorts of results in sports and in so many other things. And nature and nurture together, it's really hard to disentangle the influence, but look, they would appear to be both of significance. And at that point, the respectable wisdom then calcified completely that no, 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 you can't have a moderate compromise view on the origins of the completely noticeable, completely pervasive gaps in test scores that show up, say, in the 2000 biggest public school districts in the country. Every single one of them has pretty much the same test score gaps. There are no exceptions. Nobody in all of these decades of trying has ever figured out a way around the bell curve. All right. But to be a respectable, moderate, reasonable person, you've got to believe that it's 100% nurture that's causing this. We don't know what nurture it is. And we're not going to look at all the new genetic data about nature that keeps pouring in. We are just going to double down at getting really, really angry at the moderates who go, yeah, it's probably both nature and nurture. That's what respectable discourse demands. Now, it's not like the right has gotten more sophisticated either since the bell curve came out. I mean, for example, you saw the Supreme Court decision on affirmative action and college admission, and it's not at all clear to me that the 6 people on the Supreme Court who voted to get rid of affirmative action had really grasped just how severe that's going to be at the upper end of American academia. If you look at the Harvard data, it looks like Harvard, instead of admitting 14% Black, which would be about their share of the national population, it looks like Harvard's internal data goes, well, if we just did this really on academic skills, how well they're going to do studying a difficult Harvard curriculum. It's more like about 1% of our applicants who would get in if we just took the best students are going to be Black. And, Harvard, we're an important institution for creating new elites, and we don't feel like 1%'s the real, is a number that, that would be good for America going forward. So basically, Harvard just kept it right at 14% in the latest year, the first one post the Supreme Court's decision. And about all they did to compromise with the Supreme Court was announce a new methodology where they declared that, well, actually, even though we said we let in 14% Blacks last year, we actually let in 18% by this new way of counting. So we are compromising a little with the Supreme Court. We dropped it from, well, it looked like 14% last year, but it was actually 18% down to 14%. All right. In contrast, MIT next door in Cambridge, which seems to be on a roll trying to take the leadership of American academia away from Harvard by doing things like, okay, COVID's over, so we're going back to standardized admissions. We're not getting rid of SAT and ACT scores. We tried, it was a disaster. We need them. These diversity, equity, inclusion, loyalty oaths that all the colleges in the country in the 2020s have been making job applicants sign, that's just basic nonsense. They're gone too. So MIT went, okay, we'll compromise with the Supreme Court. We'll cut from 15% down to 5%. Now, 5%, now it's probably more like 1% at MIT. But that seems like a reasonable compromise that MIT's doing. We're going to cut the bottom 2/3 of our Black affirmative action admittees. They really shouldn't be at MIT. They're in over their head. The top 5%, they're still going to have some problems, but, or the top third, they're still going to have problems, but 5% at MIT, that's pretty reasonable taking all sides. So, but what I see almost no discussion of in the public press, whether the prestige center-left press or the spunky dissident right press, is, without affirmative action, you're just not going to get noticeable percentages of blacks at MIT or Harvard. It's just not going to happen. And are we ready for the consequences? I have this old joke about the old Nicolas Cage uh, franchise, National Treasure, which Nicolas goes around and breaks in and steals, national documents of from America's history. And so in the sequel, National Treasure,
Book of
President's Book
Secrets.
of Secrets,
Yeah.
his big breakthrough is to uh, that there's a book comes with all these padlocks, and when they make you president, they give you the key to the president's book of secrets, and then you can look up what really happened to JFK, or who are the aliens at Area 51. And I always joke that there's a Harvard president's book of secrets, which when you open it all up, it turns out to be a really dog-eared copy of the bell curve. And it says, you know, we're not going to get to any percentage that sounds reasonable to the public without putting some thumb on the scale and doing some affirmative action. So, long answer.
Okay. Well, we've managed to go from the bell curve to Nicolas Cage and National Treasure, so we're off to a good start. I'd like to mention the recent UPenn Amy Wax conflict. She was on the show sometime last year, where we hash out some of her ideas about, race relations in America. I think she's a brilliant scholar, although I disagree with many of her viewpoints. What I noticed is that UPenn punished her for, saying, hard truths, so to speak, about, the gradings of, black versus white students. But what I do not hear is that if she intentionally marked down a certain student because of their race, say if they're black, or mark a student up because of their race, say if they're white, then yeah, if she's accused of that and she's proven of that, then sure, that's obviously a case of bigotry. But UPenn seems to be faulting her for saying what she notices, hence the title of your book. Now, well, with all that fact in sight, like, even, there's a climate where we're not supposed to discuss these things, but even if we are free to discuss these things, like, say, the discrepancy between the scores of LSAT scores of whites and black students, law students, and SAT scores, so on and so on. What are we to do?
Yeah, I mean, the the argument with Amy Wax, who I had the pleasure to meet in Washington D.C. recently, um, is it's hilariously egregious. All right, so they have zero evidence of Professor Wax uh, discriminating against any student on race. They don't have even a proposal of how she might do it, since it's all blind grading. All they've got is her saying, it's really rare for a black student to finish in the top half of this introductory contracts course that I've been teaching for years. And yeah, and Penn has all the data, but they haven't brought forth any of it to show she's wrong, because she's obviously indubitably right. And it has to do with the nature of law schools, which are incredibly hardcore about how they let people in, which is basically there's college GPA, but probably more important is the LSAT score. And it's super hierarchical. I mean, Penn is like in the really strong second tier, between fourth and 10th in the country, say, but it will never get to the top tier, which is Yale, Harvard, and Stanford. And so what that means is that all the really good black applicants go to Yale, Harvard, and Stanford, and not that many of them go to Penn. And so Penn's affirmative action is, gets by with with high quality students who'd probably be, doing very well if they were going to the third tier, but they're in the second tier. And if they were superstars, they'd be going to the top tier. All right. That's how the system works. That's what the law firms of America want Penn to do. Penn is not going to change that to any large extent. They're just going to carry on as long as they can, admitting blacks, and some Hispanics using an affirmative action thumb on the scale. They just don't want their professors to ever mention it. So even though Amy is a tenured professor, they suspended her for a year and they're only going to give her half pay for mentioning what Penn does. But Penn has made no attempt to disprove her as showing that she's not telling the truth. They've got all the data to prove it. They're just going to punish her to encourage the others to shut up about how things work.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah, I think there's a discrepancy between, I suppose, inconvenient truths and noble lie, to borrow that Platonic phraseology.
Mm-hmm.
And I think much of American society has been fed, so to speak, not built upon, but fed noble lies, like the ones that you've mentioned. I guess another one too that we can discuss is that, yeah, immigration is an overall good, which obviously is not. Tell me,
I mean,
yeah, yeah.
there's different ways to run immigration. If we ran immigration the way Penn admits law students, some really high quality immigrants. If we sort of consider it, immigration is as a civil right held by the other 7.5 billion free Americans in the world to move to America whenever they feel like it, yeah, we're not going to get good immigrants. So there's different ways to handle immigration, and we should be talking about immigration policy. But once again, you run into these bell curve issues that we decided 30 years ago that we can't talk about it. That if you're a professor of law at the University of Pennsylvania, you can be suspended for talking about it. So how are we going to have a discussion of like, yeah, which immigrants do we really want? It's considered un-American to think like that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I suppose you can refer to like the 1924 Immigration Act, which bars certain immigrants from regions like Southern and Eastern Europe and only allow for people of Western and Northern Europe. And there's a strict limitation on immigrants from the Far East or Latin America, for example. So would I don't think that that sort of restrictionism should be brought back, no?
Yeah, I mean, it was an attempt to like, okay, let's not change the ethnic balance of the country. Political parties shouldn't be able to win in the future just because of wide open immigration policy. And over the 40, 50 years that it ran, it was pretty successful at turning the existing immigrants into kind of generic Americans. And we'll see if what we're doing now works as well. It remains an open question, but it also remains an open question. It's kind of like, well, if we look at how Harvard and MIT admit people, maybe we should be trying to work our way down from the top of the list instead of like working our way up from the bottom of the list. Like, hey, Mauritanians, do other Mauritanians back home really hate you? And is there something you've done to the other Mauritanians that makes them hate you? Somalians, yeah, come on over. We want you here. I don't know. It doesn't see that doesn't really seem like the way to stock the country with immigrants, but many people think that's the only morally appropriate way to do it.
Yeah,
So,
and I think with a certain lack of restriction when it comes to letting people in and all that, you risk the what I would call the balkanization of the country into certain ethnic enclaves, and that is something that I don't think people who are pro-immigration in the sense that they want to loosen immigration restrictions would want to speak of.
yeah. No, I mean, yeah. So it's it's a concern. I mean, some of it is you just take simple steps, like the liberal state of California in the '90s got rid of bilingual education. They used to take students uh, from Mexico and teach them in Spanish, and then they'd have them try to pass a test in English. And year after year, they wouldn't pass the test, so they put them back into the Spanish language classroom. And then it eventually turned out somebody noticed, actually, these kids who aren't passing the test in English, they're also not passing the math test in Spanish and all these other tests in Spanish. They're just not really good at passing tests. So for 20 years, the state of California went, we'll just teach everybody in English. And it kind of turned out that all the kids really liked English. English is cool. It's the language of popular culture around the world, and it seemed like a good idea. And so, just simple steps like that probably uh, helped out not creating enclaves. It's also a huge advantage that Latin Americans in the United States are Christians and don't have a real hostile, aggressive Muslim religion uh, that's causing no end of trouble in Europe. But on the other hand, we're starting to get people pouring in now from Africa for the first time, and that's where most of the population growth in the world is going to be, especially in the ultra Islamic Sahel, just south of the Sahara. And we need to be like have some clue as to whether do we really want a bunch of people from Chad and Mauritania showing up? Is that a great idea? Is that going to work? Nobody knows. At this point, it's just sort of considered, well, since these are just about the worst countries in the world, then we have a moral obligation to let the masses who help make the worst countries in the world into the United States, because that's who we are. We're a nation built by immigrants. Once again, just the intellectual level of respectable discourse on these questions is really sad, and definitely has not gotten any higher since the bell curve 30 years ago.
Yes. There's a column or an essay that was featured in Noticing, your essay collection, where you ask the question, is love colorblind? Where
Mm-hmm.
you once again notice that the there's a more frequent degree of what is it within interracial coupling, white men and Asian women, but not so much Asian men, white women. But
Yeah, I looked at it, 1990 census data. I just looked at who marries whom, and for interracial couples back then, it was about it was about 2.5 times as common to see a black man married to a white woman as a white man married to a black woman. And it was about 2.5 times as common to see a white man married to an Asian woman as an Asian man married to a white woman. And even the sample size was pretty small, looked like uh, black Asian marriages were about 6-1 black man, Asian woman. Um, so, uh, this is just a pattern I noticed living in Chicago, taking the L downtown, walking at lunchtime past thousands of people a day in the loop. And it seemed like a pretty interesting pattern that basically almost nobody else had written about in the mid 90s. Um, and it seems to be standing up and continuing on, but you see some patterns. I mean, the in the United States, there's less problem today for an Asian man finding like an Asian wife because there's larger Asian communities and so forth. So that's probably gotten a lot easier. But it's you bring together people from all over different parts of the world, and they have different traits and different appeals. And Asian women tended to be seen as very pretty, and um, black men seem to be generally were seen as very masculine, and you know that 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 appeals, on in the mating market. Seemed so. It was the kind of thing that when we talk about noticing, it's like, oh well, um, if you don't tell yourself, well, I'm never going to mention that, there's all sorts of interesting things out there and patterns you can find.
yes, and I know you've written about this too. I think I recently just read a piece that you wrote in the Claremont Review that it was back in the 2000s where you reviewed Leonard Sax's book, Why Gender Matters. Gender Matters. I actually also had Dr. Sachs on the show some time ago.
Good.
He wrote a fascinating essay about the Holocaust, and
Mhm.
we had a wonderful discussion on that. But I think you only need eyes and ears to see that, in gay bars and in lesbian bars, men behave in very different ways than women because they are male exclusive spaces and women exclusive spaces, and even in like heterosexual circles, you you instantly feel left out when you're when you find yourself in a group of like women talking about whatever they talk about, and you instantly feel a connection when you are in a group of heterosexual males talking about stuff. And I think there's this growing trend towards neutralizing gender differences in order to preserve or to presuppose a kind of gender equality. But I think that, a kind of gender equality or even equal treatment between the sexes can be maintained while these sociological differences between the sexes can be discussed.
Yeah, I mean, I'm I'm all in favor of men and women getting together and getting to know each other, and you know, falling in love, getting married, having kids, making a life together. Uh, did wonders for me and my happiness over the years. Yeah, I wrote an article 30 years ago called "Why Lesbians Aren't Gay." That I just started with all these things I'd noticed living in on the north side of Chicago. You know, if you go to the park, the lakefront park, in May on a Saturday, the lesbians are playing softball. They really liked softball. The gays, they're not they're not playing a lot of sports. They're sunbathing. You know, that's what they're in. They look like they've been working out all winter, or, you know, in the gym, but you know, I don't want to turn on the muscles are for display. They're not for, you know, hitting home runs the way you know, the lesbians are. Just a million points like that show yeah, that there are big differences between how the sexes you know, act, and you know, and we see among you know, homosexuals, you can get kind of like extreme versions, such as, like, since I wrote that article 30 years ago, just about all the lesbian bars in the country have shut down. There's just not that much, you know, there's just not that much demand among the lesbians to, like, well, let's go to a bar and drink and maybe hook up with somebody. In contrast, uh, you know, after one period of somewhat more restrained behavior on male homosexuals' parts after AIDS came along, now they've got drugs for all that. So now we're getting new uh, diseases spread by male homosexual, you know, promiscuous contact, like monkeypox. And monkeypox was from a couple of years ago. It was it was so clearly a gay disease that all the authorities got together and said, you know what the problem is here? The name monkeypox is just too memorable. So we're going to change it to mpox. Yeah, that way we'll make everybody forget monkeypox. Uh, you know, great. You know, let's make it harder for people to remember, you know, politically incorrect patterns. That's a high priority of our current establishment.
And of course, I have to give you a certain amount of credit for, in some ways, predicting this rather hyper focus that our society has on transgender people, because you wrote in the tax review that, well, once you neutralize these gender differences, then you then you see an increase in people who are presenting themselves as trans, because if gender differences being, well, next to nothing, then you can just switch from one gender to another with relative ease.
Yeah, the current transgender mania, the ideology that swept the English speaking world beginning about 2013, uh, none of it makes any sense. I mean, some of it is based on old feminist ideas that, you know, sex differences are just stereotypes, and others, other, you know, transgender ideology ideas are based on the opposite, that, hey, 13-year-old, do you here's a checklist of 75 different masculine traits that we can see in, like, Michael Jordan or maybe The Rock. And do you live up to all 75? No? Well, maybe if you're not as masculine as LeBron James, have you ever thought you might really be a girl on the inside? And, you know, we flip it around, and, you know, for girls who are more impressionable and more depressed at age 13, and they're going through a bigger change about, like, you know, is this puberty really a good idea? Do I really want to be a woman? The boys keep showing me pornography on their phones and it looks horrible. And here's a list of 75 feminine traits, you know, held by Katy Perry, and I only pass on 61 of them. Maybe I'm really a boy. I should have, like, puberty blocker and steroids. You know, none of it makes any sense, but we're not, we've basically declared certain classes of people to be above any kind of criticism or even just analytical discussion. So if you declare yourself transgender, we're supposed to take your word for it. We're not supposed to look at it. Now, it turns out, for example, that a whole lot of the really most famous and influential and dynamic and ruthless transgenders in the United States are what I call X-Men, and they were never a girl on the inside. I went to MBA school with a guy who 30 years later, I'm reading the Washington Post and an article about the highest paid female CEO in America, who turns out to be this fellow that I took marketing strategy 101 with in 1981. And it was just about the most arrogant man in the whole MBA program. But he had reason for that because he was also just about the most intelligent. He was brilliant. And he was like the science fiction hero. He kept telling me, Steve, I'm going to make my fortune in shooting rockets into outer space. And in 1981, I was like, yeah, okay, great. Yeah, I read Heinlein too. Good idea. But isn't that kind of a government monopoly these days? And then 20 years later, I'm sending him a check for $25 a month for his satellite radio that he invented and built these companies. Just a science fiction hero. But that's a pattern that nobody talks about. Is like a bunch of these X-Men tend to be very bright, not real nice guys ever in their life. And they've got this weird sex fetish that is aroused by other people acting, validating them dressed up as a woman. And it's basically toxic masculinity at its most extreme. But the word for the sex fetish, autogynephilia, the New York Times has used it twice in the history of the New York Times, the Washington Post twice. Why not? Well, if you mention it, the autogynephilics will cause you no end of trouble. They are like the SEAL Team 6 of cancel culture. You don't want to mess with them at all.
All right. So just a segue to a different topic. What the I guess the liberal internationalists and the neoconservatives, I don't think that there is a real distinction between those
Sure.
two, other than the fact that one seems to dislike the UN more than the other, to be honest.
Mhm.
But they, during the early 2000s, they both seemed to agree that, Iraq can be turned into a democracy because, well, the people of Iraq share the same values as the people of the United States of America. And you wrote a piece called Cousin Marriage Conundrum, where you argue that it's the fact that, well, you guys do not know the neocons and the lib internationalists. They do not know the fact that, this is a common practice in America. That is one of the main reasons of your hubris and your failure at the end. So, tell me more about this practice.
Yeah, I got the idea from a neocon anthropologist he was trying to come up with ways to justify invading Iraq in 2002, but but he still wanted to tell you about how Iraq is organized, which is it's extremely clannish. And in fact, it was getting more clannish because more people were marrying their second cousin or worse, their first cousin. And it was the most prestigious form of marriage was, all right, say you own a goat herd, you and your brother, how are you going to divide it up among your grandsons? Oh, well, if my son marries my brother's daughter, then the grandson they have will be our mutual grandson. And so we'll be able to leave him this huge herd. And there's all sorts of good reasons involving property rights and so and inheritance that it makes great sense. The only problem is to have a country, to have a functioning democracy where civic minded people get together with people who aren't their relatives and go, what's best overall for the whole country? How could what how should we sacrifice to make Iraq a better place? And that's not going to happen in Iraq because everybody is so closely related to their relatives through all this cousin marriage that you know people who aren't related to them, they're just strangers. And you can see these patterns all over the world. It's not just in Muslim countries. It, it's probably not something that Muhammad came up with and promoted. It's probably more like, well, yeah, that was how things have always been organized here in the Middle East. Um, but yeah, it's a terrible way to organize a country if you want it to act like Germany and Japan after World War II, where we get together and go, for the good of Germany and Japan, we're going to impose some new rules on you, but you're going to like them, and because they're going to make Germany and Japan prosperous countries that aren't all go around starting all these wars. And you know that was never going to happen in Iraq. We weren't going to make them into Iraq into the new Switzerland with this form of cousin marriage being so dominant. And yeah, that's pretty much what happened. It turned out to be just an endless, struggle of everybody against everybody. And, nobody really stepped forward and said, like, well, the Americans have shown us the way to be a big unified country. And said they just started drilling holes in each other's heads, and chaos reigned, clan fights everywhere, just like you'd expect.
I'm curious what you think about Hungary at the moment, what the government is doing. Because well, I'm sitting here in the nation's capital, and for the past what 5, 6 years, Hungary has been the liberal intelligentsia's favorite punching bag. If rank after say Russia or Turkey or any other um, autocratic nation out there. Um, so yeah, tell me, what do you think about
Yeah,
Hungary doing?
I don't know much about Hungary. Seems like you know the uh, the liberal world is mad at Orban for doing things like you know he fired the journalists who work for the taxpayer supported news media and replaced them with his supporters. And you're not allowed to do that if you have a leftist taxpayer supported national media. You're always supposed to have a leftist taxpayer supported national media, no matter who keeps winning a majority in the elections. That's democracy. um I I don't really get it. You know Other things Orban's done, like stand up to the Ms. Merkel in 2015 when she invited 1 million marching Muslim men into Europe and go, we don't really want them. What? Wait a minute. Why is the Chancellor of Germany getting to order Hungary around? That doesn't have a good precedent. Um, and now, I was just reading before I came on a New York Times article promoting Ms. Merkel's new memoir. It'll be out in a few days, and she's released uh, the highlights of her memoir that all involve like, here's something bad that Trump did, here's something bad Putin did. And, I read through all the highlights and there's absolutely no mention of 2015 and the million marching Muslims. That's just been swept down the memory hole. We don't have a term for it or anything. So, um, you know, I'm reasonably positive about Orban. On the other hand, I see pictures like, oh, here's the soccer stadium that Orban built in his home village. And I go, wow, that is a beautiful soccer stadium. That's really something. How much did that cost, by the way? So, yeah, there's probably some downsides to Mr. Orban's career as well. But, far from me to say anything about it because I'm thousands of miles away and the language is really different. How do you get along do you speak Hungarian?
I'm taking classes.
Good.
Yeah, and I think he represents a part of Hungarian culture. I think the more nationalist and patriotic part of it, and I think for Hungarians they view the nation in a way that's very different from the English speaking world. So
Yeah.
I think there lies a
I mean,
misunderstanding.
as long as Orban doesn't like, decide he's got to go invade one of his neighboring countries that, got stuck with that has a big Hungarian diaspora across the border, let's not go there, people. The borders that we've inherited aren't the greatest borders, but especially here in the United States, we got great borders, and you know, I don't really want to see the world going back to where countries are constantly invading each other to move the border 100 miles. You know, Europe is full of nice cities, and let's not like blow them up with artillery over where the border should be.
Yeah. Well, if you happen to be in Budapest at some point in the future, well, love to
Great,
visit around.
thanks.
Yeah. Another thing too, that the whole liberal intelligentsia neocon uni party consensus is that Ukraine seems to be, the model of liberal democracy, whereas before 2022, when Russia invaded the country, it was seen as well any other um, newly democratized communist country, a hotbed of political corruption. So because of Zelensky's heroism and the Ukrainians' brave sacrifice, nobody's really talking about their the still endemic corruption that the country is experiencing.
Yeah, I mean, uh, you know, I'd hope that someday Ukraine can get on the more encouraging path that Poland and it's similar extent to Ukraine, Hungary, Czechoslovakia have, where you get your economy going. The politicians don't steal too much to get in the way of prosperity. Um, you know, I'm a big fan of the luckier Eastern European countries. Um, but Ukraine's prospects not good. They weren't good before. Just like getting hammered by giant Russia for years, it's not good. Um, if you can kind of see a, a solution where it's like, okay, the Ukrainians push the Russians back to the other side of the big Dnieper River. If they can dig in and have enough defenses, enough concrete ditches and so forth, then they could give up territory and not have to worry too much that the Russians are just going to retool and come back after them in 5 or 10 years. That would be the big concern. The other is it sets a bad precedent. I mean, centuries, millennia, the job of kings was to go invade your neighbor and take some of his land. And, and but then after World War One, Europeans went, that's not a good thing anymore. This invasion, industrialized warfare is awful. Let's not have a great war again. So they passed around 1928. They started passing uh, treaties and so forth, saying, okay, don't start wars. That's bad. Uh, and in general, it's proven pretty good. Life in Europe has been better over the last 75 years or whatever, without, cities being completely flattened to the ground like poor, Warsaw was and so forth. Europe's got great cities. Let's not blow them up. Um, so, Putin violated that. In 2014, what he did was clever, and it was kind of ambiguous. I was sort of assuming when there was all this talk in 2022 that Putin was going to come up with something that was pushing the envelope a little further, but wasn't just tearing up the post World War II consensus that you just can't go invade your neighbor and annex his territory. You know, only Israel has been allowed to do that. And for a long time, until Trump got in office, Israel wasn't really supposed to do that. And everybody was treating Israel's conquests in 1967 as, well, we're not really recognizing it as Israeli territory. It's the occupied territories, and something will eventually happen to change that. But Trump came in and went, okay, Israel, you can have whatever you want diplomatically. Oh, Morocco. Yeah, if you recognize Israel, we'll recognize your conquest of Western Sahara. So Trump and Kushner started tearing up this old system that it's like, no, you're not really allowed to conquer other land and make it permanent. The rest of the world will treat it as something that, if you guys screw up and have some instability, Western Sahara might walk and no longer be part of Morocco. But Trump did that. It had some successes, but my impression was it probably encouraged Putin to go, okay, let's just go invade. This will be easy. We bribed everybody in Ukraine, but it turned out the Russians, the Russian secret spies bribed the Ukrainian corrupt politicians, and they all took the money and flew off to Cyprus or built infinity pools in Bel Air, California with it. And so then the foot soldiers have been fighting away ever since. And, war is like really awful these days with these flying death robots over your head, dropping, hand grenades on you. It's horrible. We don't want to have any more wars. Anyway,
Yeah.
So that's my view. I'm against war. I'd like to see the current one end, but I'd like to see it end in some fashion that it's not going to start up again, just down the road. And I'm not sure how to get there.
Right. Yeah, I think we can end on this note. I think you mentioned Islam and Muslim a few times. I think in the Western world, Islam is generally seen as an Arabic religion. But for me, who
Mhm.
came from a Southeast Asian country, which is Vietnam, the
Mhm.
closest Muslim country is Indonesia, where the population is, well, far from Arabic. There are a few
Yes.
great beaches in Bali and, of course, in the Java Islands. But from what I hear, the Arabs treat their Indonesian Muslim brothers and sisters as basically inferior. Um, they they seem to think that only the Arabs are the true heirs of Muhammad's last prophecies and whatnot. And the more I learn about Muslim theology and how they treat other Abrahamic religions like Christianity and Judaism, and also how they treat people with non-religion. The less optimistic I am that, well, one, liberalism as we understood it to be, will take root in Islamic soil, and that, groups, ethnic Arab groups will adopt a form of liberalism when they're not in Arabic lands, say Europe or America. And
Yeah, I mean, Islam is a pretty successful ideology at extending itself, at preventing defections and so forth. You know, my friend, the geneticist Razib Khan, had a good insight into why places like Indonesia, which had for a long time seemed like not much of a trouble spot, despite being very Islamic, were becoming more hardcore Islamist over time, despite centuries of doing a good job of adapting Islam to the local culture and so forth. You said it was like, yeah, when they brought jetliners that could get you to Mecca cheap, then what would happen is the richest guy in the village would make the pilgrimage, the Hajj, and then he'd come back. He and his wife would talk about their trip to Mecca and go, well, I know we do things this way here, but when we were in Mecca, we did it the Meccan way, the way Muhammad told us to. And so then everybody else is like, oh, well, I better not do that faux pas again. In fact, I should go to Mecca and find out the Meccan way, and then I can lord it over all the losers who haven't been to Mecca yet. And pretty soon everybody's booked a flight to Mecca, and now they're really into hardcore Islam, the Arabic way. Um, so yeah, that's a problem in general that that the whole world has. I mean, the good thing about Indonesians are they like Indonesia. There's 250 million of them, but they really don't like to leave, so they're not flooding the rest of the world. So I'm like, God bless them, and don't please just don't turn into the next generation of ISIS. So we'll see how that works out.
okay, well, on that note, thank you very much
All right.
for being on the show and keeping on noticing, I suppose.
All right. Well, let me do a pitch here. I got you. Okay.
Okay, okay.
My book, Noticing. You can buy it for $30 in paperback. You can buy it from Passage Press. Just Google it. Uh, you can get free shipping. Look around for deals. I think the word Wilson will get you free shipping in the United States. If you are outside the United States and you want the $30 paperback, I would recommend Amazon as about half price to ship it. If you want a Kindle version and read it online, Amazon will sell it to you for $10. It's a great deal, and you can get it today anywhere in the world. All right, my other pitch, I've got a Substack. It's called Steve Saylor. Saylor is spelled with an E, stevesaylor.net. Not yet .com. Maybe I'll get that pretty soon. But stevesaylor.net. I post pretty much daily there, and that's an important part of my franchise. All right, I want to thank you very much. It's been a lot of fun, this talk. Sorry about rambling on so long, but I had a good time.
Yeah,
Let's do it again.
of course. Yeah, I'm open to a sequel of this.
All
Okay,
right.
take care, Steve.